Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. Wanted to talk a little bit about Russia. Ukraine has been less in the headlines until very recently. President Putin is making some pretty significant threats. We saw over this weekend big attacks on Kyiv, larger scale than we've seen in quite some time. And then the Kremlin threatening the Europeans and the Americans, telling all Western diplomats to evacuate, all Western citizens to evacuate. There are going to be systemic strikes on Kyiv. Even the foreign minister, Lavrov, calling up Marco Rubio, U.S. Secretary of State, and saying that passing that message on directly, which Rubio did not particularly respond to, said he was passing it on to Trump. He's not going to do anything with it. The Europeans aren't leaving, and we'll see if the Russians actually follow through. But the point here is that this is a response to significant success that the Ukrainians have had in attacking Russia. Success on the front lines and starting to take territory because their drone capabilities and unmanned capabilities are much greater. Also success because Elon Musk has cut Starlink off from Russia, and that means that they are well behind technologically being able to respond to those strikes by the Ukrainians and launch their own. And then also recent strikes going deep into Russia, some of which have clearly been targeted against civilian areas. I mean, for example, some high-end or luxury apartment towers around Moscow. Most recently and most tragically, some 21 young Russians, looks like some kids in there too, killed. The Ukrainians saying that these were recruits for the military. The Russians saying no, it was a dormitory. But the largest number of civilian deaths that the Ukrainians have caused inside Russian territory since the war has begun. There's some almost 400,000 Russian deaths, a staggering number over 4 years, the biggest civilian deaths we've seen in a war since World War II. But those are the front lines, the so-called meat grinder. This is not Russians in Russia. Here we have a different story when the Ukrainians are targeting non-soldiers. And what's interesting is that the Russians have made a lot of that in terms of their state media. There's been a lot of Kremlin talk about it, a lot of journalists talking about it. So not ignoring all of the Russians that are being sent to their deaths, but rather playing up what the Russians are calling terrorism by Ukraine against Russian civilians. Now, to be clear, targeting civilians is a war crime, and the Ukrainians in the past weeks would be guilty of that. The Russians have been doing that consistently in much greater number, at much greater scale, for 4 years. And of course, they deny all of that. They don't talk about it. Their citizens are unaware of it. It's appalling, and they started the war. But having said all of that, the question is, well, what is Putin up to? And if he's making this a big deal for his own citizens, then clearly he's planning something spectacular in response. Now, is that spectacular something that he can actually get away with? Can he do it? Ukraine is limited in their Patriot missile battery capabilities. There's been supply chain challenges there, not least because the production is not what it needs to be globally, and because a lot is needed in the Gulf. But the Russians also don't have all that many hypersonics available to them, and they're not producing them in large number right now, given their own supply chain challenges, technology challenges. So it's a question of what they're going to do. I'm not surprised that there's no further U.S. push against Ukraine saying don't do this stuff. In fact, Marco Rubio washed his hands of the Russia-Ukraine war just a week ago, said the U.S. is no longer going to engage. They can if it's useful, but it's not useful right now. And of course, if you're Putin, what you read on that, this was the biggest thing that Trump was trying to get done successfully. And the pressure that Trump has been putting has been largely on Ukraine, not on Russia. So the Americans washing their hands. If you're Putin, you're saying, oh, that's the Ukrainians aren't going to be having that pressure going forward. In fact, the United States is engaging more with Ukraine to figure out if there is a drone capability that the Americans can help scale up for their own military industrial complex purposes. So, I mean, if anything, the fact that Zelensky has shown he has the cards now gives him more leverage with the Americans, makes him less unuseful and harder to throw against the curb. The question is, I mean, the upside of this would be, well, if the Ukrainians are winning and the Russians can't accomplish what they want to, it should be more likely that the Russians will back down and accept a ceasefire. And a rational leadership with good information would be more likely to do that. Putin, on the other hand, very pot committed, getting older, looking a lot older, with people around him that are increasingly not very capable, and feeling as a bit of a dead ender. He's done so much damage to the Russian economy and had promoted so much propaganda about what is and is not happening on Russia-Ukraine. It would be hard for him to back down. So the potential tail risk that Putin would launch more devastating attacks against Kyiv and try to just utterly destroy larger and larger numbers of civilians. I don't think it's likely, but it's more plausible than if we were talking about the Chinese, for example, or the Americans, for example, where there are far greater checks and balances in different ways, but in both countries. It's more plausible. The Russians have been certainly focusing more on the Ukrainians fighting a proxy war for NATO, saying that drones coming into Russia have been traversing NATO airspace. In the case of the Baltics, for example, that even saying that some NATO countries have been responsible, Baltic countries, for launching drones against Russia. Certainly, they're trying to put those countries on notice. You're in danger if you support Ukraine. They're not going to stop. But might this also be Putin willing to take broader shots directly and not just asymmetric shots against NATO countries? Again, I don't think so. But as this war goes more badly for Putin, I wouldn't take it off the table. So on balance, good news for Ukraine, good news for Europe, good news for NATO, should be good news for the U.S., broadly speaking, certainly is for Democratic and Republican leaders, just not particularly Trump. But may be dangerous in terms of how we think about ultimate Putin climb down and whether he's capable and willing of doing that. Anyway, 4 years in, so much damage, still not close to this war winding down, and certainly potential for escalation from the Russians in the near term. That's it for me. Talk to y'all real soon.